Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to a new episode of this Living Yoga podcast, which has been in a little bit of a pause during the last few weeks for very big reasons, which we will disclose right on time. But in a short notice, our dear baby has been born, so Eva is on maternity leave, and I am here now, very, very happy to have finally a conversation that I've been looking to have for about 3 months already, maybe even more than that. So let me share you a little bit of the story of this encounter with Daniel, who you'll meet shortly. When we had our retreat in April of this year in Spain, Daniel joined us, and very quickly on the retreat, we came to learn that he is not just any participant, but he is also the author of a book that we have here and we're going to discuss today, which is the book The Truth of Yoga. Here it is so that it shows clearly. And he's just we had a great time just talking, sharing from his perspectives, our perspectives. He was a very humble participant in the retreat, and I have also now enjoyed so much reading his book over this last period of the pregnancy. I was reading out loud to my wife every night and just digesting some of the concepts that Daniel brought. So just first of all, of course, I want to welcome you, Daniel, and thank you for being part of this conversation. And if you would be so kind to share with this audience, what is your background? What brought you to yoga? And what is your mission currently?
Well, thank you, Gabrielle. It's a pleasure to be with you. And yeah, I had a lovely time on retreat with you and with Eva. And yeah, we did have some great conversations. And I think it'll be fun to revisit some of those themes and also to break some new ground today. I mean, I'm a yoga practitioner. That's why I came on retreat. I've struggled with various ailments in recent years, particularly arthritic hips, which may have in part been caused by my overdoing it a little bit with my yoga practice. But these things are genetic as well. And that's led me to ask a lot of questions, I think, about why I was doing what I was doing and how I was going about it and even what I was practicing. And to be honest, that's yoga philosophy, the what, the why, and the how of why we're doing things. And I have been for the last 15 or 20 years really studying yoga philosophy in various forms in India with teachers I was practicing with, but also more recently academically. About a dozen years ago now, I did a master's degree, and then from there ended up teaching short courses for the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. And out of the questions and answers that used to occur in each of those sessions, I started making notes that turned into the book, The Truth of Yoga.
Mm.
So I've become, I suppose, a yoga nerd. And my job really is to talk about the history and the philosophy of yoga. But I was only ever really interested in those questions because of my own, to a certain extent, doubts about my practice. In that I had teachers who would recommend I picked up popular yoga texts like the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita to find out more about where things came from, and I would look there and there was nothing about the practice that we were doing in class. There were no
Mm.
postures, there were no sequences, there wasn't even really much pranayama. And so I wanted to know what the difference was between these old texts and the modern techniques. And so that's how I got sucked into, studying further.
Mm.
But as a result of that, that's meant that my mission really is to raise awareness to a certain extent in the yoga practitioner world of a lot of very insightful information that has been uncovered by academics. Who are translating texts from Sanskrit and other Indic languages, but also looking historically at the evolution of teachings and helping us to understand that there's never really been one thing called yoga. There are many, many different phases of evolution of many different strands of things that are all known under this label of yoga. And we can't do all of them at once, in fact. There's actually no way of containing them within the same system, really,
Mm.
apart from that they've got the same name. So we need to get a little bit more familiar with the little part of that vast ocean that we're swimming in and understanding perhaps what are the ingredients so that, yeah, particularly as we're moving forwards with our own practice and perhaps as teachers, able to explain that to people and also to make wise choices about how we innovate because we can't avoid innovating. We are always trying to think, yeah, in terms of our own practice, but even more so with students in front of us, how to be helpful, how to, make things accessible, how to make them relevant. And it can be very easy to just go completely off piste and invent a whole new thing and call it yoga, as the world is full of. And my
Yes.
mission, in a way, is to try and help people think about how to do that in alignment, really, with the spirit and the principles and the key themes of earlier teachings from Indian traditions.
That's beautiful. That's beautifully said. And that is something I really enjoyed about your book. And again, I want to show everyone the book because it's a very beautiful cover. I really enjoyed this. And what I really loved about your book when I was reading is that, first of all, it was not written in a very strongly academic language. So it was very easy for the layman to read. Anyone can pick up the book and get interested about the concepts you're bringing. And I also really enjoyed, and I think this was on purpose because this was if I remember correctly, this was little essays that then turned into a book. Is that correct? It was that you sat and then did the whole book at once, right?
No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, it was a deliberate choice on my part to break things down. So it's got maybe 100 chapters and they're
Yes.
all like 500 words long. They're like a long social media post. And
Yes, but I enjoyed that very much because every night I could read a concept, not for an hour or so, for 10, 15 minutes, read a concept and then digest it and think about it. Because what happens to me and maybe to many people is that, let's say you're reading a book like War and Peace by Tolstoy, by the time you are in page 800, you already have forgotten so much of what happened in the beginning that it's hard to put
yeah.
all together unless you are an avid reader and you spend a lot of time doing it. But this book was very nice in that sense that I could get ideas, internalize them, digest them, and then move to another idea and another idea. And you had a really good way in the book of interacting with the reader in a sense that you are stimulating thought about what is happening. It's not just this is the truth, this is the only thing you need to know. And what you're mentioning now, there is different truths, different streams from where the knowledge of yoga comes from, and that was very enjoyable to me. And I would highly recommend the book. One of the many reasons would be one of those. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you to say so. I think I should probably clarify that the title, "The Truth of Yoga," is yeah, potentially a little bit misleading in that I don't have the one truth that everybody needs to know. In fact, there is no such thing. It says on, I think, the second page that there's never been one truth, but that is a liberating truth in and of itself. The real truth is the one that we can access for ourselves through our own inquiry. And yoga is a quest for truth in a way. It's a quest to see beyond our avidya, our opposite of true knowledge. And so something has to be done to spark that inspiration. And what I've tried to do by drawing on, the major yoga texts that people would be familiar with, from the Upanishads to the Yoga Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata epic in which the Gita is contained, and then the medieval teachings that grow out of Tantra that shape more physical yoga practices known as Hatha Yoga. So through all of that, we just see these little, I guess, building blocks, almost like bricks of Lego, which you can then construct into different shapes, because they're all contributing something to, the process that evolves from there. And we are then able to do exactly as you were describing. Dive in, read a little chapter, and think about one aspect of yoga practice, and it might not be necessarily even one that we're focused on. And to think about, well, maybe there's a way to incorporate something from there into what I'm doing. And so a lot of the time, what I'm trying to emphasize is that things that have been influential in yoga history might not be things that we would actually want to do. To take one
Mhm.
very important example, asceticism, people who,
Mm.
retreated from society, did really painful things to their body deliberately so that they would, detach from the feelings of discomfort and no longer be caught up in trying to please themselves through their senses, so that they might see through the illusion of ever being satisfied through the senses and instead find some deeper satisfaction within. Um, and as soon as we start to speak about it a little bit like that, we can recognize that's kind of what happens in an asana class, where you're asked to make a shape that feels not so comfortable and to breathe into it and find a way to be there just for a little bit and not to immediately, through a conditioned response, run away from it. And we start to see, that's how, very old and influential strand of yoga philosophy is still alive in modern teaching. But we're also invited, I think, to think more creatively about, well, what else can I do in my life that embodies this tapas, this heated intensity of effort that is transformative, that alchemically somehow transforms one's consciousness, without necessarily thinking we have to go back to the beginning and do it the hard way, the old way, the traditional way. That's the true way. Actually, the
Mm.
real truth is that it's all in evolution, in flux, and for us to find a way of embodying that here and now that makes sense to us, and not to try and be somebody from 2000 years ago from an Indian cave, but somebody living in the 21st century wherever we are.
That's so well said, and I agree wholeheartedly because, well, in fact, this is what led me to teach what I am currently teaching, this lineage of yoga the Aurobindonian part of strand of philosophy, which I really enjoy, which is the applied philosophy, as you mentioned, the opportunity to experience the teaching in a physical way, but also, if you want, in a more philosophical way, theoretical way, sitting and reading and so on, through meditation. And the concept of, as you mentioned before, the old yogic concept of renouncing the world, going into a cave, retreating is, I would say, something that if most people would come to class and the first thing they'll know is, hey, you're learning. This is something you're about to learn. You're about to learn how to retreat from the world and get out of the wheel of reincarnation and unite with the divine, for example. I think most people would be quite confused, and I really enjoy that. For example, in the our Sri Aurobindo tradition, that old concept was changed to the making life divine on earth. And of course, that's a whole new strand of discussion that maybe we can go deeply one day. But the idea of having an applied philosophy, not just discussing topics for the sake of it, but having an intention behind, which you can explore physically if you wish to, but also intellectually, like we are doing now. So it's been a really nice process for me as a student also to move from going to an asana class and seeing the teacher doing some acrobatics and thinking that this is some kind of calisthenic workout, to then becoming, as you mentioned yourself, a yoga nerd myself and diving into all the books and feeling that, if I'm going to be a teacher and a student, I need to know all these books by heart and the tradition is so important. Then to the stage of teaching and listening and learning that I am today, which is this of as you mentioned, the evolution and how can I, while respecting the tradition of yoga, still evolve with it. And that's what I am currently focusing on as much as I can.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. And it comes across in what you present. And there's a real openness in the spirit of what you're doing that, is channeling something that's very personal and immediate in this moment, but is also, somehow a little bit timeless. It's a connection to something from this vast cosmic ocean that is almost outside of time and space, that is, the space into which we tap through yoga practice.
And Daniel, what would you say, for example, to a student who is beginning yoga, let's say someone who has come to my class or a retreat, and who, through the practice of asana and the insights that the teacher can give, feels the spark of, I really enjoy this teaching and I would like to dive deeper. Apart, of course, from recommending them your book, what, how would you guide them into entering this world of, as you said, yoga can be pretty much anything today. I was just reading in your book, as a last part of the book, you were saying there were some drunk yoga classes, which
Yes.
I've never heard about this, but I can imagine that there can be something like that because, well, you can just put the name in it and sell something because it sells well, at least now. What would you recommend to, let's say, the version of you that went to that first yoga class and liked it and you felt like, this is nice. What would you say to that younger version of you?
That's a wonderful question. I know what happened when I asked my teacher, who was a very serious, committed practitioner in the Iyengar lineage, right at the beginning, what should I do? And he said, read Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and that's where I got very confused. So I probably wouldn't say that, not because I thought, it was a terrible idea, just because you need some background context to be able to do that. Um, Honestly speaking, I think it's just a question of starting to pay attention to what we're feeling and to actually, see the practice of yoga as extending beyond the mat and beyond the classroom. So yes, sure, we come out of yoga class, we feel different, and it sounds like we're on a path somewhere that's very interesting. We want to know where it's leading. We want to know all of the things that there are to discover. But actually, it really helps to pay attention to what's happening right there, right then. And for me, going back to the beginning, I kind of skipped your original question, which was what brought me to yoga. I mean, the honest answer is a chronic cannabis habit. And I, I felt like I needed to try something else. And the commitment to going to the yoga class in the evening at least stopped me getting high until after class
Mm.
initially. And
Thank
yeah,
you for sharing.
well, the fact was that something was happening in that class that was touching a similar space in me. It was making me firstly feel okay in my own skin, and secondly, I think just yeah, turning down some sort of intensity, agitation, anxiety setting in my brain to a level that this is tolerable. Okay, life's okay. And before long, I actually no longer felt the need to be getting high every day. And within a year, I had decided to quit smoking cigarettes, and a couple of years after that, stopped smoking weed. Yeah, I'm not going to crusade against weed smoking. I enjoyed it a lot at first, but it wasn't for me in the long run. I had become quite depressive and stuck in my life. And yoga practice helped me because I was able to start paying attention to what it was doing for me. But that was again only really because I had a very good teacher who was trying to, throughout the whole class, get us to pay attention to what our bodies were doing. So without even being instructed, I was starting to sense that that was the thing that was happening to me in the class. I was watching as well as doing. I wasn't disconnected from myself, having an out of body experience. I was more embodied while watching. And then I started to realize I can do that more as the day goes along. And when I'm getting anxious or stressed, I can still be in the feeling of my body with these
Mhm.
things happening. So I'd almost just say, let's try to take, 5 minutes a day when we're not in the yoga class and bring the same presence of concentration to everything that's happening. Instead of observing whether the big toe mound is pressing into the ground correctly, it can be just, what am I actually feeling in my jaw, in my stomach, in my hands, in my spine, and if I also pay attention to my breathing, am I able to have a little bit more space around what's perhaps a triggering feeling in me while still being able to function rather than completely losing it and screaming or running away or whatever else I might do in response to something somebody says or something somebody does or something that I feel throughout the day. And so none of that you're going to find in an old yoga text, but I think that's starting to point us towards what yoga is inviting us to experience, which is more presence, more clarity, and more ease in this embodied experience. And then as we start to be a bit more capable of doing that, then perhaps it's possible to sit in meditation. And I think honestly speaking, that would be the next thing that I think is really important for people to remember is that for most of the history of yoga, that was the practice.
Yes.
there wasn't some thing called yoga that people did on mats involving all these fancy shapes and you're getting, strong and flexible, and something else called meditation that people did on cushions, or whatever else they might have sat upon. But actually, yoga was meditation, and when the physical practices were becoming more and more varied in the last 1,000 years or so, it was initially for the purpose of making it more possible to sit still for longer periods. And in the modern world, you might find teachers saying, "Oh, yes, that's the sort of," again, I heard this very early on in my experience in asana classes, "we're doing this because it's preparation for meditation." But we never
Mm.
actually did any meditation. We just did all the preparation. So
Yeah.
again, just, saying, well, let's make it really basic. See how it feels to sit for 5 minutes with absolutely no technique. Just can we be there with ourselves for 5 minutes and
Oh,
watch how difficult it is to do that? And that's
oh,
okay. That's the practice. It's fine. Then get
yeah.
up and go, "Oh, okay, now I have a cup of tea," or get my phone out again.
Yeah, the phone, exactly. That's the eternal distraction, and especially now with all the stimulation we are receiving all the time. But thank you. That's a really good point, and it brings me to a beautiful quote from my teacher that he talks in his book Fire of Love, Adil, about that yoga in its essence should not only make you feel good, but should help you feel good. Like that the feeling essence should be increasing. The capacity of feeling should be expanded. And I think that has been for me the biggest revelation of yoga as a practice, my expanded capacity to feel and to perceive both within and outside. And through the teachings that I receive inside, being able to extrapolate and live my life in the world with this enhanced sensitivity, sensitivity in the good sense of the word that you can perceive and notice. And that inevitably brings change. As you mentioned, I don't think you had to go to how would you say, like an AA course for marijuana, but it just happened naturally because it was the process of enhanced feeling that led you to the conclusion that, okay, this is maybe not necessary in my life anymore. And it was also the same for me with many other things. I would say in many ways, yoga ruined my life as I knew because I was studying in a most prestigious law school. I was heading to a very stellar law career, and then this yoga came into my life, and everything shifted. Because I was living on autopilot in a robot mode, basically, doing what I felt I should do because this is what is accepted by society. And then finally, I was given the opportunity to feel, to enhance, and to develop my inner perception. So then it was not even a question of, oh, what should I do with my very prolific upcoming career? It was, I need to change. And this is natural and it feels just so easy, so effortless. And many of the big changes I have experienced in my life, thanks to yoga, have not been conscious even, has been just easy, a very easy leading into something that feels and is better for me. So in that sense, yoga has been fantastic for me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think it touches on a theme that you raised earlier of renunciation. We
Mm.
can think of renunciation as this, radical practice of turning away from the world and being an ascetic and growing a long beard and not having any contact with anybody else. And that's not appealing. But actually, the capacity to say no is also renunciation.
Mm.
And developing an empowerment within us to sense when it's time to say no, and even for that not to be a resistance, but as you say, to be a completely natural sort of turning away. Perhaps even don't need to say no. We just have an inner sense of, okay, that's not for me, whatever it might be. And that's a very powerful thing. It also helps us actually to set healthy boundaries in the world. And there's a lot of yogic philosophy, especially as taught in the modern world, particularly dressed up for Western seekers, that almost sort of suggests we just need to dissolve ourselves into the beauty of this oneness that is
Hmm.
in everything, and we can just be all interconnected. And isn't it lovely? We are pure love. We are the divine. You know, I'm not saying that's not true on some level, but just starting with that, I mean, that's the end of the road. And
Yes.
telling ourselves that can be a great way of avoiding, in fact, that there's lots of things that we don't want to just merge with. There's lots of things that can be quite harmful that, perhaps are empowered themselves by framing it with that philosophy. There's all sorts of abuses that have occurred within yogic and spiritual context because of people overly trusting in the idea that all good things were coming towards them, and
Absolutely.
also the other flip side to it, I think, is remembering you were talking about sensitivity. And I like that quote from Ideal about being able to feel good. But we also have the capacity to be okay with things that don't feel okay, to not
Hmm.
lose our agency in the face of that, and to not need everything to feel good all the time, while at
Yes.
the same time not turning into masochists who are deliberately courting difficult and painful experiences and rationalizing them with it's just my karma or whatever it is that some dodgy guru might encourage us to do.
Yeah.
So we develop the capacity to, I think, be a little bit more accepting of reality the way that it is, while retaining the agency to say, okay, but still, that's not okay, and I'm going to
Mm.
either walk away from it or put up a barrier in the face of it, or learn from it. But I don't have to be completely destabilized by it right here, right now. I'm still able to be present with it. And that for me has also been a fascinating subtlety to start to engage with, because I used to have an aversion, I think, to these ideas about acceptance and surrender and even just trust. I think I
Mm.
had lots of trust issues, and
Hmm.
in a way, I thought there's lots of things out there in the world that aren't okay. So this yoga philosophy of trying to become okay with things as they are, basically the santosha that Patanjali talks about, contentment,
Yes.
accepting the world as it is, that sounded to me, very unhelpful at first, and I found that that was something that I distrusted. Um, Precisely because I hadn't really understood that it was possible still with an acceptance to have a sense of this is still not okay and I'm going to turn away from it because it's unhelpful.
And
So,
it's levels of truth, right? It's a
yeah.
different, it's the teachings get to you at different stages. And what sometimes, just like in an asana class, when you say, for example, hey, everyone, get a brick for Trikonasana and put your hand on the brick, that is not the truth of the pose for in absolute terms. Maybe your hand needs to be on the floor, your hips need to be properly aligned and all this. But when you put the hand on the brick, you can experience the truth of the pose according to what your body can do in that moment. And so in this sense, I'm guessing, for example, what you mentioned about Santosha, it's a level. At some level you can be in contentment, at some other level you can reject maybe
Hmm,
that teaching. Hmm,
yeah.
interesting. Daniel, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the concept because you mentioned this in the book also, and I would love to get your perspective on this because it is a big deal for students, especially those who may be coming from religious backgrounds that are not Hindu, especially in the Western world, that associate yoga immediately with Hinduism. And it's like,
Hmm,
okay, I'm not doing this because this is a religious practice, and therefore I don't want to do anything. I don't want to have to do anything with it. Uh, in your own research, how do you see the connection between the practice of yoga and all everything we've been mentioning already, and the concept of Hinduism, and which is of course a religion that has many thousands of years. But I would love to hear your perspective because at least from what I have learned, and I have been trying to get information from all different points of view, uh, and I think you mentioned this in the book too, yogis generally incentivize the looking within, the going within, and finding your own truth and your answers, which if you have a text that says exactly how you should behave and act in the world, otherwise you don't belong to this. Doesn't
Mm.
it seems a bit contradictory? So where do you find yourself into this discussion about yoga and religion?
Great question. And yeah, I'm a little hesitant in approaching an answer because I think, yeah, the real truth is there is no one answer to this. It is a
Mm,
very personal thing. Starting with where you were at the end there, this concept of pratyaksha, which is direct perception, is prioritized in certainly, the yoga system of philosophy that comes from Patanjali as the number one sort of source of truth for a practitioner. So we shouldn't take anybody's word for anything. And in that sense, yoga is quite anarchic. It's not very interested in institutional structures or doctrines or dogmas,
yeah.
to the extent that scholars who write about the later traditions of Hatha Yoga, which developed in the last 1,000 years or so, that's the time in the history of yoga where we start to see something other than just sitting or doing
Mm,
painful things to your body. That it doesn't really have a philosophy. Its only philosophy is practice. Do
mm,
these practices, and they will take you into a state of clearer seeing, and we'll, through the awakening of energies in the body, make that more likely to happen. But
mm,
the only way you'll experience anything is to do it, and there's nothing that can be said about it other than get on with it. And then there are various things said about where it ultimately leads, but the basic philosophy is do it. And although those traditions of physical practice have basically come from a worldview influenced by Tantra, and the tantric traditions of India are basically religious in that they are devotionally oriented primarily towards Shiva, or forms of his consort, the goddess, or in some cases Vishnu, and yeah, to a certain extent others creep in there as well. That doesn't show up really in the yoga practice texts that develop from this tantric tradition, because really all that happens is Tantra says there's no need to renounce your body. It doesn't say go to a sacred sex workshop. I should make that clear. That's the sort of modern Western idea of that. We don't need to rationalize that with reference to Indian traditions. If we want to go to a sex workshop, we can do that.
mm,
But what Indian Tantra was talking about was that, all energized matter, so everything living, is divine. And that's all at the level of vibrational atoms. Effectively, it's the same as a modern physical understanding of the way that the world is put together. It's just that there's an equation of the highest principle of pure seeing with the deity. And so, in that sense, there isn't necessarily an external, being to whom one bows down in the most sort of influential strands of these traditions. It's all to be experienced through us, by us realizing that there is no actually individual us. There is only the energetic pulsation and the presence of pure perception. And those two things together make life. It's either in the same way that Patanjali talks about Purusha and Prakriti. There is the material world and this spiritual component. Except the tantric traditions that I'm talking about fuse all that together and say it's all one vibrational mass of subatomic particles. So in that sense, yes, God is there, but it's not really, what we would call God. It's the idea almost of Einstein that the natural world is awe-inspiring, and it's part of us. We are it. There is nothing other than this totality that we are composed of.
mm,
So it's a very different sort of approach to the idea of a Western tradition. And what is most interesting to me is that some of the texts on physical practice explicitly say you don't have to believe anything to engage in the practice. And let's see if I can dredge out that quote from a text called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which is from about the 13th century in India. Dattatreya is a fascinating character. He's a sort of, as it were, kind of deity of yogis, but he's not really a god in that sense. He's sort of the ultimate sage. He's got many forms, and he's the sort of formless kind of, I guess, embodiment of everything into which all difference collapses. So in that sense, that's what yogis are always trying to do, to go beyond all those distinctions. But there is a statement at the beginning of that says, I'm getting a bit abstract here, so let me come back
Mm.
to what he actually says in this text. Hopefully I can find it. Yes, here we go. So whether you're a Brahmin, which is basically a Hindu, whether you are an ascetic renouncer, whether you are a Buddhist, whether you are a Jain, whether you are a tantric, or whether you're what's called a Charvaka, a materialist who doesn't believe in anything, basically an
Mm.
atheist. So long as you have faith and devotion towards your practice, you will succeed. Success happens if you practice. How could it happen if you don't? It doesn't come from reading texts. It doesn't come from dressing up in, the ochre robes of the renouncer, or saying Narayana, having matted hair, saying Namah Shivaya, or any of these other religious mantras. It comes from practicing. And if you don't do the practice, you won't get anywhere. If you do, it will have its effect. So yoga is actually a practical discipline that transforms the way that we see. And what we might find as a result of doing that, we'll discover for ourselves. And some Indian traditions describe what happens in terms of a divine way of seeing and being. But there is in that kind of invitation a reminder that it doesn't have to be that way at all. In fact, it could be a way to become a more grounded Christian, Muslim, Jew, atheist. It's
Yeah.
possible to enhance one's faith and devotion to any worldview through a clearer perception of reality. Or perhaps to let go of some of our, perhaps dare I say, childish ways of seeing what the religious world means, of the idea that you have to follow all the rules or somebody's going to punish us. Instead, there's I think a deeper teaching that all the world's religions are in their own different ways talking about transforming the heart. And we can get into that space and realize perhaps that that's the more important thing than whether or not we've said the right number of mantras, prayers,
Mm.
whatever it is, in order to tick the box of performing religious life, but instead to embody religiosity in the way that we interact with each other. And so whichever worldview one has, I think yoga can enhance the capacity to do that. But there's another dimension I should probably come back to, which is that a lot of the texts that we read have come from traditions that these days would be called Hindu.
Yeah.
And there's no escaping that. So if you pick up the Bhagavad Gita, it is, I mean, the title of the text refers to God. Bhagavan is the name for the Lord.
Yeah.
Gita is a song. It's God's song, that book. And it's got Krishna, who is the embodiment of the divine, giving, yoga teachings. So if you find that off-putting, that's perhaps not going to be the go-to text for inspiration.
Mm.
But at the same time, I like this about Indian traditions. I mean, to put all my cards on the table, I came to this as an atheist
Mm.
and a skeptic. I was a journalist before I was a yoga practitioner. My entire worldview was built out of suspicion, distrust, asking awkward questions, being dissatisfied with all the answers. So, I turned to this with the idea that, well, I'm not going to take any of that stuff at face value. And yet the Gita has become one of my favorite texts because
Mm.
I think it does something quite magical to how we see the world. It promotes the idea of service, really, that by putting some other priority in front of us, and you will know this as a new parent, it's
I was
impossible
just
to
going
be
to say that.
it's impossible to be self-centered. And if self-centeredness is the problem and a transformation of the heart is the aim, the easiest way to bring that about is to put something else external to us in that place and bow down before it. And if the idea of the embodiment of sort of loving devotion in some form of deity works for us, then that's an easy way out of the trap of self-centered confusion. And that's basically what the Gita says. But
That's
it also says the flip side of that is to just do what needs doing for the love of doing it as an offering. Um, doesn't even have to be offered to God. God will be
mm,
happy that you're doing it, is basically what Krishna says. But the main thing is that you're not self-centeredly grasping after, I want to get everything I can for my own private satisfaction, but instead, giving of, our capacity to the community. And
mm.
that's what teaching's all about.
That's beautiful. That's so wonderful, everything you've mentioned so far with regards to this. And I would like everyone who's listening, if it was too much at once, just rewind. Rewind Daniel,
Sorry.
put him again, maybe listen to him a couple of times saying this because what a profound truth is what you're mentioning. And I think it's truly the essence of what, at least through the direct experience that you're mentioning, yoga teaching has given me, is that direct experience of the path that for me reveals the truth and what is at the highest aim for me. So beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this. And by the way, just a more practical question regarding this,
Mm,
the Bhagavad Gita, which is a text I would also recommend everyone to explore at least and see if they can get something there. What would be the best version of the Bhagavad Gita you would
mm.
recommend as a layman student to read? Because I have about five translations and they are all can be quite different. Which one have you found in
Yeah.
your experience to be the most accessible for a Western person?
It's a wonderful question. I don't think there is a single right answer to that again. I mean, I've got different versions that I value for different reasons. I
Mhm.
mean, if anybody is feeling nerdy, my absolute favorite one here is a big fat volume translated by a guy who I think was a jazz critic for the New Yorker, Winthrop Sargent. He taught himself Sanskrit and he produced this wonderful translation that takes every verse of the Gita page by page and breaks down all of the Sanskrit word by word. So it enables us to see how the translation has come together. Because part of the problem we get reading texts in translation is we don't know how accurate or reliable that translation is. And often the best guide for us that we are perhaps even misled by is what pleases us, what sounds appealing.
Mm.
And what sounds appealing is not necessarily the same thing as what's true. And so, I find that wonderful. But that's yeah, perhaps more for the committed. My favourite from an actual practical point of view of it's accurate, but it's also explaining it in context, is written by my colleague at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, whose name is Nicholas Sutton. And it's called, I think, A New Translation and Study Guide. So he writes a little bit of a commentary in between each little chunk of verses. So you maybe get somewhere between 5 and 10 verses at once, and then he'll unpack them, explain them a little bit. And that's really the course notes from his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita course.
Mm.
Um, and that's come together in book form, and it's very nicely put together, and it's a good one to start with. But honestly, I think coming back to the very sort of simple way in, any edition is worth having a look at just to
Mm.
see what's going on there, and to also be open to the fact that it might not make sense at first and it might be a bit off-putting, and you might think, especially if you start at the beginning, why is this thing happening on a battlefield? Why are the first couple of dozen verses just lists of soldiers? And where's the yoga in any of this? And then there are lots of questions that arise. So honestly speaking, I think reading these texts gets so much easier in some kind of course format. Um,
Yes.
so having somebody there who's able to answer questions, and also to give a little presentation that helps to make sense of a small part of the text that you then go away and read for yourself with some kind of framework for understanding it. So actually, I would recommend the courses at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, or I have a course myself on the Bhagavad Gita, or that they come to you, Gabrielle, and say, let's sit down and have a Bhagavad Gita book club where we
Right.
go
I would
chapter
have to
by
do. I will
chapter by
have to do one
chapter.
of those. Yes, I will have to create one of those. I don't know if I'm ready for that, but thank you. That's really good because I have found myself I have about three or four translations and I always get a bit um,
Hmm.
lost in translation, we
I
say.
know the feeling.
Mm. Now, let's move a little bit and to start wrapping this conversation, I want to bring everything now to the present time.
Hmm.
How do you feel about yoga today? And by yoga today, I mean everything you see. And let's circumscribe this to the Western world in particular, how
Hmm.
it has ended up evolving. I really like how you guide us in the book through how this evolution has happened from the Indian roots a few hundred years ago to the most prominent teachers of the last century in India and how they started, uh, Western students started coming and they started traveling to Europe. My
Hmm.
teacher himself, he was sent by Iyengar to spread his knowledge in both Europe and the United States.
Hmm.
And that evolution has created something quite particular. How do
Yeah.
you see the yoga world today? What opinion, how do you feel about it?
Well, I don't know where I fit into it, is the honest answer. To give a brief sort of yoga practitioner biography, I started out as an Iyengar yoga practitioner. I met Mr. Iyengar a couple of times. I went to see him teach in China in 2011, and then I went to his institute in Pune the year before he died. And I found myself a little bit frustrated with some of the rigidity of that method, as we talked about
Yeah.
earlier this year in some detail. I then tried another branch of the Krishnamacharya lineage. So Krishnamacharya was Iyengar's teacher. He also had a number of other influential students, one of whom was Patabi Joys, who is the no longer around, but was the creator of the practice that gets called Ashtanga.
Yeah.
And to be honest, those two strands of Krishnamacharya's teaching have probably been the most influential in shaping what we see in the yoga world. Um,
Yes.
they also have had quite a rigorous and serious approach to training teachers, in that there was never really teacher training as such. There was apprenticeship initially, and then in the Iyengar world, there were these certifications that required you also to do a lot of practice teaching under somebody else's supervision. Um, but there was no way of getting a piece of paper and running off and calling yourself a yoga teacher with no
Yes.
experience. You really had to have your teacher's blessing, and your teacher was not going to give that away lightly. Um, but they contributed to very important ingredients: the Ashtanga method, the idea of flow, moving between postures, perhaps guided by the breath in a kind of rhythmic, sequential way, building a class out of that. We all know that now. That's everywhere. That became originally called power yoga, later
Yeah.
vinyasa flow. Goodness knows what it's now called. There's so many different brands that people keep inventing every year.
Yeah.
But the combination of that and Iyengar's approach, which was to get very specific and detailed about what to do with your body parts, um, the alignment instructions, they are the basic building blocks of a lot of physical teaching. Even teachers who've never had anything to do with those lineages are teaching some combination of instructions for what to do with your body while moving through some kind of a sequence.
Yeah.
And all of that is relatively new. There aren't old texts that describe either of those things. And the kind of evolution of the last 50 years has been to start questioning some of the things that have come from those traditions. I mean, let's also be honest about some of the abuse that's gone on in that world. Patabi
Yeah.
Joy's yeah, touched his female students inappropriately without their permission. He basically molested them. Iyengar was a very angry man, and he would hit his students sometimes and shout at them. And that sort of history of institutionalized yeah, telling people what to do or grabbing and molding their bodies has led to some skepticism about that approach to yoga, which has, I think, been quite helpful. It's led people to think more about an intuitive understanding of what to do, which comes from our own sense of how we want to move, which isn't about external instructions in quite the same way that these days gets broadly called somatics. But
Yes.
yeah, that's a kind of Western thing. It's not a traditional Indian yoga thing, and
No.
then we end up with approaches now that are very popular in the UK of blending yoga with all forms of strength training, really. So going to the gym. I like the gym, it's great, but it's again nothing to do with yoga necessarily. And what I'm really building to saying is, although those, lineage structured yoga systems from India that became popular initially in the West, and there are many others. There was also Shivananda yoga, Satyananda yoga. The system even that Bikram came out of was a serious school from Calcutta.
Yes,
Yeah, they're no longer so dominant, and instead there's all of this innovation happening. And sometimes it's possible actually for it to lose the yoga, um, because yoga is not necessarily, as I was emphasizing earlier, doing things with the body to make shapes. Yoga was originally a state of being. That's
yes,
how the earliest texts define it. So, frankly, we can try to do anything in life in a way that will perhaps harness the potential to access that state of being. But it's
mm,
also possible to do all sorts of things with the body that lead us in exactly the opposite direction. And
exactly.
the whole point of yoga is to
Building the
see be
ego.
Yes, yeah.
I
And
mean,
even attachment to the body. The whole point of
mm,
yoga is to see beyond the body, to say, we're not necessarily this body. In fact, when this body dies, that's okay. It's just a natural part of life. Things come together, they are maintained for a while, and then they fall to pieces. We were talking about gods earlier. That's what the three main deities of the Hindu Trimurti symbolize. Brahma creation, Vishnu preservation, Shiva destruction. Never-ending cycle. That's what life is. It's like, the water cycle, or the fact that ashes to ashes, dust to dust, they say at funerals. But yeah, so things are just coming and going. And so what happens these days, I think, is a lot of potential danger of getting attached to the body, getting ego invested in what it can do, and showing off. And that's not really yoga. But I'm not going to go around and tell anybody off for doing it. I just think we should be aware that the more embodied and the more focused on, getting more skilled at what we do with the body, the Western and global yoga world gets, the greater the danger of losing sight of the fact that that's not actually what yoga was all about. And in fact, we might be leading ourselves away from the yogic potential rather than closer.
absolutely. That's a very good point. And if the practice is enhancing and building your ego, then there is something to definitely be observed there. Because at least in the way I have experienced the practice directly and how I've been led to feel it, is that yoga is essentially a practice of humility. And in what we were mentioning before about the direct experience, the understanding that there are different perspectives, that is all part of humility. But the act of, for example, practicing a particular style, feeling that you are, oh my God, my body is transforming. I look so good. I'm going to post this photo, and then you get lots of likes, and that cycle of, it could even be like a type of narcissism that you see
Mhm.
everywhere pretty much. It's dangerous and should be observed. Not so much because I mean, it for sure may give some economical money benefits or fame or all of this, but in the long run, it can be very detrimental to a person and
Mm.
cause so many of the pitfalls that you see on the older generation of teachers who have been trying to embody these practices for many years. And then you see in their lives what is the end product of their practice. I like that sense that I can see in the 60, 70, 80-year-old teachers, yoga teachers, both in India and the West. You can look at their lives and see, okay, if you've been practicing for 50 years and now I can see you, I can meet you, is in you something I would like to imitate or go towards, or
Mm.
something I'm definitely repulsed by? As you mentioned, all the abuse scandals that have happened, well, the famous documentaries in Netflix about Bikram and about Osho with the Wild Wild Country documentaries, and so many of the problems that have been happening in the so-called yoga world
Mm.
should definitely be observed. And it's something I'm trying to stay aware of as much as I can during my practices with all its flaws and all the ups and downs I have. So Yeah, definitely very important. And I think for the modern students, at least those who come to my classes, I try to always emphasize this concept of direct experience of feeling, connecting with themselves. In our practice, we use the heart center as the anchor for the expression of that. And we have found that this has been, for me, in the results of my life, in the fruits of what my practice has been for the past 10 years, very, very useful. It may not be like that in 20 or 30 years, but so
Mm.
far it's been the approach that I have found most empowering for me. And what you mentioned about the body is also something important to mention because it is easy to get really deep into the practice. And you mentioned this was maybe a mistake you made, that you got so deep into the physical aspect that you may have caused harm to your body. And I'm not sure if, in its historical context, yoga was about doing these really intense physical practices that may harm your body. I mean, my teacher, Adil, in our podcast before, which and even to my surprise, I heard him say this because he was a very devoted Iyengar teacher, very prolific in the United States, trained all the biggest teachers there. And yet he said, if I teach a teacher training again, the asana is going to be surely a small part of it. And then the rest, we want to discover what yoga truly is and what living this concept is. And that's, I think, or I hope that as the years pass and a more sincere aspect of yoga comes up, then we can move into forms that lead us more to ourselves. We take care of our bodies, absolutely, but it doesn't become the only focus of the practice.
Mm.
And I think this is already happening in some ways because maybe many of the people who have jumped into the yoga wagon purely for the physical purpose and the physical enhancement, and yoga is good for sex, yoga is good for sports, yoga is good for this and that. They are, I feel, I don't know what you think about this. They're already maybe moving on into other projects, into other things, into some people call it somatics. Maybe they're doing strength training, they're doing other disciplines, and maybe what is left after would be those people who are really devoted to the practice and want to make it evolve into something that is more pure.
I keep hoping that's going to happen. I mean, the entire time I've been aware of yoga since the 1990s, it's been an ever expanding bubble boom situation, and
Mm,
previous, let's say, exercise fads, aerobics, jogging, they were both big in the 80s. They came
mm,
and they went, and I thought yoga was going to do the same thing. In the sort of early 2000s, I thought surely we're hitting the peak now, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And that was partly because of this teacher training model.
mm.
More and more teachers getting produced, desperately looking for opportunities to teach, sharing what they know, and perhaps that's nice. But
Mm.
there's just this proliferation in yoga people continuing the industry, even though it's getting harder and harder to function economically as a yoga teacher. Uh,
Definitely.
so put that aside. But yeah, I keep hoping that eventually all of that trend will move along to something else, and what will be left will be a sincere interest in yoga. And I think what I've come to realize is, firstly, I have no control over what anybody else does.
No.
And secondly, there will always be lots of things out there that I disagree with. But what I do have some control over, and what I can try to approach with integrity, is what I'm doing. And I've become, that's partly why I'm sort of describing myself as not sure where to fit in the yoga world. Um, I'm choosing consciously not to teach asana classes anymore. There's lots of people do that. I'm talking about ideas. I'm talking about how to make ancient ideas relevant to modern life. And I'm also trying to keep enough of a maintenance level practice for myself that I remember through these physical techniques, that there's something more to me than that. And in a way, they keep the cobwebs clear in my creaking old building of a body. And
Mhm.
that's just about enough to be able to do what I need to do. So I wouldn't want to give up on those things, but I don't want to focus on those. And I think actually for me, the number one thing that's become clear is the problem is that people think that yoga means postures, means
Mhm.
asana practice. If only we could use the word yoga for what it always meant, a much broader conception of things, and speak about asana as asana. Um,
Mm.
then there would be a lot less confusion because then it's a question of, is my asana practice supportive of an experience of yoga or not?
Mm.
That's very
Absolutely.
interesting. Then we can start to think about making progress. But if we're just assuming we are doing yoga by making some shapes, then I think we've lost all connection to the
Yeah,
transformative potential.
that's very true. That's very true. Hmm. I think that's a good place to end this conversation with so many wonderful insights you brought, and I hope the audience, those of you listening, have the opportunity to listen again because there's been so many really good concepts that have been brought. I hope some of your questions about the truth of yoga have been answered by Daniel, who has been so kind to be with us. I would like to finish this conversation by letting you, Daniel, engage with the audience and invite them to some of the things you are currently doing. What are you up to, and how can people benefit from your knowledge? For example, if they're in Finland, can they engage with you online? Is there some way they can connect with you?
Well, thank you, Gabrielle. Before I answer that, I feel that I should probably make clear that I'm another confused individual who sometimes makes sense and sounds coherent like this, but is just engaging with worldly life and making mistakes and trying to learn from them. And I'm definitely nowhere near the end of my journey on this
For
path.
sure. For sure.
And that's partly why I like teaching because I try to do it from a place that is, acknowledging that and also explaining that I don't have all the answers. And actually, we all need to try and search for our own answers. And just to sort of emphasize that's the spirit in which I offer what I offer. So if people do want to explore some study with me, the main thing I'm currently offering is a year-long program, which is quite a commitment. But that's called the Path of Knowledge, and it's co-created. We meet every 2 weeks. It starts in September, runs for basically the academic year, but it's not academic. We're looking at the history and philosophy of yoga in depth with some academic materials, but then meeting for 90-minute live sessions via Zoom on alternate Sundays to talk to each other about our own experiences and priorities. And I've learned so much from the other participants in that course this year, partly because they've got different experiences. They're coming from lots of different parts of the world. So there's people from Asia, from Australasia, from the United States. In fact, about the only continent I think we've had nobody from is Africa. And so there's a very diverse group. And I find that very enriching for myself, but also inspiring because we're able to help one another in the process of learning. And I think in some ways that's the future of teaching, rather
Mm.
than the guru has all the answers and we defer to them. It's an open process of asking. And of course, I've learned a lot of things that I'm trying to share, and I make them available. But I'm really happy to have somebody come with a completely different perspective and talk about it. And we'll maybe end up with them showing me that there's something I hadn't really thought about and that I perhaps need to go away and learn about. So, that's I sort of say that up front. If a year sounds like too much of a commitment, you can go to my website, truthofyoga.com, where you will find some free talks with an introduction to the Gita, an introduction to the Vedas and the Upanishads, a little bit about the philosophy of Patanjali. You can just stream those, you know, as you like. But there's also some courses about the individual texts, which you can study at your own pace, with the opportunity to have some live interaction with me as an extra if you wanted to do that. And then finally, through the Oxford Centre of Hindu Studies, sorry, for Hindu Studies, where I teach a variety of online courses about yoga. Every 3 months, they're starting things up. So OCHS
And,
online.org.
and also you have a podcast.
That's true. I almost forgot. Yes. Ancient Futures, it's called. And yeah, I've got all these things sprawling over far too many different online outlets these days. But if you go to truthofyoga.com, there's a link to my podcast there. You can find it, or you can find it on Spotify, Apple, all the usual places.
Wonderful. Ancient Futures, then, with Daniel, if you want to go there and dive deep into more conversations. And I hope maybe in the future we will have the opportunity to not only talk again, maybe collaborate and help shape and the evolution of yoga into a place where we feel its roots are honored, yet there is room for its continuous transformation into something that is better for everyone. So thank you, Daniel, again for being part of this call, for taking the time to be here. And I'll see everyone in the next podcast. Thank you again. Bye bye.
Thank you, Gabrielle.